No, it's like, oh no, no, this is actually your work. But like, I start to feel like I want to find something that was Protestantism. It is insufficient to not talk about wait. That's why I really appreciate it. It's like learning immensely. Thank you. Thank That felt a long way. I
Oh, Marcus does.
So in terms of order, I have is that okay? So I have Dr. Harvey, Dr. Parker, Dr. Wells, Gogoman, and then Dr. So I pronounce it correctly.
I'm at my last skill.
Here you go. What do you mean? Yeah, I have one.
Oh, yeah.
This is exactly the kind that it's literally the same kind of pen that I left in the car.
So, yeah, I thought about that too, right?
We're gonna come back together. It's a little after 3:00. And so we're gonna go ahead and get started. My name is Malcolm Cameron. I am a PhD candidate in the history department here at UVA, and I not religious studies, I'm not a theologian, but I have the offer was extended to help support this conference, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's my pleasure to introduce the participants in today's panel on Blackness, Epistemology, and Religion. Dr. Marcus L. Harvey is an assistant professor of religious studies at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. His research expertise encompasses indigenous, African and Africana religious thought, Zoroastrian Hurston, Black folklore, literature and religion, the phenomenology of Black religion, and epistemology. Some of his scholarship appears in the Journal of Africana Religions, Estudos de Religio, Religions, Palgrave Handbook of African Traditional Religion. And at present, Dr. Harvey is completing a monograph entitled Life is War, African Epistemology and Black Religious Hermeneutics, which aims to re-theorize the Black religious consciousness in the United States through phenomenological exploration of indigenous, Akan, and Yoruba epistemology, as well as Black literature. Dr. Kai Parker is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. He teaches African American religious history. His research interests include Black Messianism and apocalypticism in Black religion, the relationship between Black studies theory and historical methods, and the intersection of race, imperialism, and social theory. His book, City of Black Souls, Chicago, and the Black Apocalyptic Imagination, is forthcoming from the University of Pennsylvania Press. He has also taught Black Studies and Black History courses at State-built maximum security prison outside of Chicago. Dr. Alexis Wells Boogerman is an assistant professor of religious studies in the religious studies department at Stanford University. Her first book, The Souls of Women Folk, The Religious Cultures of Enslaved Women in the Lower South, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2021. It is a gendered history of enslaved people's religiosity from the colonial period to the onset of the Civil War. It won the 2022 prize for the best first book in the history of religions from the American Academy of Religion, as well as the outstanding first book prize and Rosalind Turber Penn Book Prize from the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora. The book was also a finalist for the 2022 Frederick Douglass Prize awarded by the Gilder Lehman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. Dr. Wells is currently working on her second, a 2-volume documentary history of religion and slavery, and an edited volume theorizing new directions in African American religious history. And she received a BA in English from Spelman College and a Master of Divinity degree, and PhD from the University. Dr. Domini Ogunaki is an associate professor of African religious thought at the University of Virginia. His research is focused on Sufism in West Africa and Sufi poetry, as well as indigenous African and Afro-diaspora religions, especially Ifa. He is the author of Deep Knowledge, Ways of Knowing in Sufism and Ifa, 2 West African intellectual traditions. It was published by Pennsylvania State University Press in 2020. Poetry and Praise of Prophetic Perfection, West African Mahdi Poetry and Incidents in 2020, and then the Book of Clouds, which was published this year. He's currently working on a project putting indigenous African and Sufi traditions into conversation with Europhone, decolonial, and Black rap traditions, and other projects on Africana philosophy, Sufi poets, and Yoruba mythology. So let us welcome our panelists.
All right, thank you all for having me. I'm pleased to be here. I've decided to title my remarks for today, Thinking Through Blackness, a Contribution from African Epistemology. This is an adapted excerpt from an earlier chapter in my book. So that's my sort of theme for today. What is Blackness and how is it known? What is the role of religion in such knowing? On one level, Blackness is a vestigial sign of indefinite ownability as tradable subhuman American capital. Blackness encompasses fetishized, commodified bodies that embody their owners' prestige, writes historian Nell Painter. She explains further that, quote, enslaved Black people were not simply likened to money, they were a kind of money that not only could be bought sometimes by the pound, sold and rented in the market, but also regulated by law and subject to warranties, trials, and return. Even more to the point, semiotically, she writes, slaves were collateral for commercial, speculative, and personal loans, end quote. Relatedly, Blackness is also a sign of existential and cultural catastrophe, issuing from totality of American empire and of unfettered state-sponsored subjection to the unmatched hostility of colonial Christianity. For example, John Butler described decimation of traditional African religious systems in the mainland colonies between 1680 and 1760 as an African spiritual massacre, stemming, quote, from violence and repression, as well as from an open contempt for different religious beliefs. And it resulted in a cultural destructiveness of extraordinary breadth. He goes on, no other religious event of the entire colonial period, including the evolution of Puritanism or the emergence of American evangelicalism, so shaped a people's experience of religion in America, end quote. Moreover, on a deeper level, Blackness signals a profound transgeographic ontological dilemma, perhaps best captured by Martinican theorist Frantz Fanon when he penned the following words in 1970. As long as the Black man is among his own, he will have no occasion except in minor internal conflicts, to experience his being through others. There is, of course, the moment of being for others, of which Hegel speaks, but every ontology is made unattainable in a colonized and civilized society. In the Weltanschauung of a colonized people, there is an impurity, a flaw that outlaws any ontological explanation. Ontology, once it is finally admitted as leaving existence by the wayside, does not permit us, to understand the being of the Black man. For not only must the Black man be Black, he must be Black in relation to the white man. The Black man has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man, end quote. The entry of the Fulani, Mandinka, Wolof, Akan, Yoruba, Igbo, Congo, and other African groups into the modern geography of what John Thornton calls the Atlantic Zone meant not only the bizarre transmutation of African difference into Blackness, but also the proliferating philosophical evisceration of African being by the second half of the 18th century. To invoke Charles Long, African bodies became opaque Black bodies with neither history nor ontology. These bodies were, quote, negative structures of concreteness, in complete service to the psychic stability of whiteness and its voracious imagination. While in one sense, Diane Stewart and others are correct in positing recently that Atlantic diasporas were spaces of dislocation and captivity that, quote, happened to African Americans via enslavement and the technique of racial blackening. It is also the case, as many have argued, that Africa and Blackness happened equally to the modern Atlantic. This resistive, always unfolding happening, as dynamic as it is unlikely, enables Fred Moten's Fanonian framing of the problem of Blackness in terms of the following questions. He writes, does Black life in its irreducible and impossible sociality and precisely in what might be understood as its refusal of the status of social life that is refused it constitute a fundamental danger, an excluded but imminent disruption to social life? What will it have meant to embrace this matrix of impossibility, to have spoken of and out this suspension? What would it mean to dwell on or in minor social life? This set of questions is the position, which is also to say the problem of Blackness, end quote. Both Moten and Fanon suggest that Blackness, though ontologically inert from the point of view of white modernity, nonetheless represents an unsettling, even dangerous, living presence, an impossible yet imminent social disruption that persists despite its subversively marginal relationship to our normative social order and the deep, sprawling Protestant roots lying beneath the surface. As such, what would it mean to epistemologically and conceptually, what would it mean epistemologically and conceptually to push Blackness beyond the cultural boundaries of Protestantism and, to recast one of Moten's ideas, consider an alternative ensemble of interpretive possibilities? Du Bois gave us a language for theorizing the interstitial nature of Blackness in the United States context, the unresolved two-ness that at every moment threatens to irreparably rupture the Black psyche. However, the creative, connective epistemological potential inherent in this unreconciled condition is often overlooked in favor of narrowly privileging the problem of race in America, among other things. Scant attention is given to the ways in which double consciousness naturally facilitates the processes whereby Africa inserts itself into the problem of Blackness as at a cultural level. I therefore propose a theoretical focus wherein Blackness is treated less as a racial category per se, and more as an ancestral category. It is important for clarity to note that the adjective ancestral here is used in an African, specifically Akan, and thus relational sense. This means that for our purposes, the ancestral has to do both with genealogical linkages to the spaces and history of African humanity and with ways of knowing that have been and continue to be formative for African people across geographies. A central claim I invite us to reflect upon is that approaching the quandary of Blackness from an Akan ancestral perspective has fresh epistemological potential for our understanding of it that is not bound by the hermeneutical limitations of race, global Protestantisms, or other species of Christianity. Worth mentioning is that while the concept of ancestor is usually defined among the Akan of Southern Ghana along heavily traditional lines that emphasize morality and felt power of spiritual agency in the physical world of living descendants, it is by no means an ossified relic with little connection to the modern present or future. On one hand, Akan tradition holds that the ancestors consist of a relatively elite group of once human moral exemplars, often founders of clans, who are posthumously elevated to a spiritual role involved in the protection of individuals, families, of course, clans, and all other members of the society with which they are associated. The ancestors are believed to punish those guilty of seriously destructive behavior that threatens human life and the moral order of society. As one scholar puts it, ancestors are in a real present sense spiritual, quote, authority figures who maintain the norms of social action and cause trouble when these are not obeyed, end quote. And yet they do not work in isolation, unaided. Rather, ancestors, quote, form a chain through the links of which the forces of the elders, now with the community, exercise their vitalizing influence on the living generations, end quote. According to Magesa, the operating principle of ancestorhood is presence, not abstract ontological difference or distance. For the Akan, influential relationship with the dead in their erstwhile communities on earth is assumed. This more traditional explanation notwithstanding, we must also recognize other interpretations of Akan ancestorhood that stress inclusivity, as well as the importance of historical change and adaptability. Philosopher Kwame Gyekye insists that, quote, certain individuals now long dead who may not have held any honored positions in society or been known to have led morally excellent lives or married or born children may nonetheless have made important contributions to the culture of the time and hence to the cultural heritage of a subsequent generation. Thus, if the celebration of ancestorship is a celebration of a people's cultural heritage, then the ancestors, the original creators of that heritage, would include many more than just a few individuals. And since culture is the product of society, it might be appropriate to say that by ancestors, we are referring to the entire membership of past generations of a people, with the exception of those of them who died in their infancy or at a very young age. Not just a few individuals who are supposed to have led virtuous lives, end quote. So this interpretation significantly broadens the ancestral community in Akan religious thought to include more links in the mnemonic chain of not only continental African humanity, but also Atlantic and global African humanity. To extrapolate, Gyekye's ancestral chain, in theory, includes Blackness, since the latter encompasses individuals, families, and communities who were, are, and will be creators of perduring cultural heritage throughout the African diaspora. Furthermore, on this reading, ancestorhood is not tradition bound or otherwise temporally frozen. To the contrary, it is responsive to the vicissitudes of historical circumstance, able to adjust and evolve as needed without completely abandoning tradition. Gyekye references three relevant Akan proverbs. The first proverb translates rather simply from Twi into English as times change. The second states, quote, the resting place of the ancients, i.e. the ancestors, we no longer rest there, end quote. And the third avers that, quote, a person cutting a path does not know that the part that has been cleared behind him is crooked, end quote. Taken together, these maxims direct attention to the dynamic nature of historical events and situations, and hence the ongoing need to reevaluate or perhaps recreate inherited traditions. They also underscore the crucial role of future generations in assessing and improving upon the older paths hewn by previous generations. Implicit in all three maxims is a firm sense that each new generation carries the responsibility of engaging the life worlds left behind by their ancestral forebears. A common thread tethering both of the above approaches to Akan ancestorhood is a well-rooted acknowledgement of relationship as the context of ancestral knowing, and by extension, self and communal knowing. Knowledge in this sense can be likened to a flowing cultural stream that can be grasped only through the intimacy of drinking from it, a mutualistic act for which there is no practical substitute. The racializing mythologies of Blackness, though admittedly ever present from a wider historical purview, are disempowered by this epistemological exchange. For what matters most is the dynamic humanity and spiritual insight reflected in the legacies being encountered, not the narratives manufactured to eviscerate the same. Similarly, the exchange demotes the prestige that Protestant Christianity has for centuries enjoyed as the world's preeminent negative scriptor of Blackness. Rethinking Blackness in this manner positions the African religious sphere as an alternative matrix for knowing Blackness in other ways that follow different scripts born of ancestral relationship with African humanity across time and tradition. To be sure, the tenability of my proposal is strengthened, for instance, by the cultural precedent established by the Akan and Yoruba movements in the 1960s in the United States, for which New York's Gus Dinizulu and Detroit's Walter King are credited as founders. Unlike the current proposal, both of these movements had nationalist dimensions, well outside the scope of my epistemological focus. Nonetheless, the movement's evince an inveterate reconnective impulse that has bearing on our discussion. Also worth noting by way of precedent are studies such as Ross Michael Brown's 2012 book, African Atlantic Cultures in the South Carolina Lowcountry, which explores how African descended people in South Carolina from at least the 16th to the 20th centuries relied upon Congo divinities known as Simbi to interpret their foreign New World environment, build new communities, and forge meaningful spiritual lives. To conclude, the work of Tiffany Patterson and Robert Kelly suggests that as a product of diaspora, Blackness, like diaspora, is always in the making, ready to be unmade and remade at any given time. Therefore, to borrow Patterson and Kelly's language, Blackness, along with diaspora, emerges simultaneously as a process and condition, whose African ancestral linkages and epistemological potential are, quote, not inevitable, and thus in need of theoretical articulation. This brief reflection represents an effort to envision and sketch an African epistemological translation of Blackness that takes seriously the religious and moral traditions of indigenous Africa. It invites questions about the role of Africa in the discursive evolution of Blackness toward an uncertain future that may never escape Afro-pessimist Frank Wilderson III's arcless flat line, a metaphorical depiction of the shapeless fate that countless Black slaves endured as subjects of American empire, or Calvin Warren's ontological terror. If in the social realm, Blackness is a kind of absent, shadowy presence, as the work of Moten shows, then it seems fitting to bring Blackness into hermeneutical contact with the figure of the ancestor in traditional African religion, whose job it is to preserve and uphold the full constructive presence of humanity in society. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. And thanks so much to Michelle, Chris, Anderson, and Malcolm for organizing this really amazing gathering, to my fellow presenters and to all the amazing presenters from earlier today. My paper is called David Walker's Appeal to Heaven, Slavery, Political Necessity, and Religious Contingency in the Revolutionary Atlantic. And this is very kind of new work, so hopefully it makes some sense. So one of the things I study is Ethiopianism. And Ethiopianism can be broadly defined as an aspiration for the liberation and redemption of the African diaspora oriented by biblical references to Ethiopia. And here the word Ethiopia refers primarily to the African diaspora writ large. And for Ethiopianism, the preeminent biblical reference to Ethiopia was from the KJV, Psalm 68:31, princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God. Ethiopianism is often thought of as a Black Protestant ideology, but it extends far beyond Protestantism and disturbs the binary of Protestantism and its others. The most well-known form or kind of development of Ethiopianism is probably Rastafarianism. Ethiopianism often manifests as movements for Black religious independence from white authority, political or ecclesiastical. So one way to think about Ethiopianism beyond Protestantism is via its confrontation since the late 18th century with Western thought's valorization of what can be termed the judgment of necessity. In Western thought, since at least Augustine in late antiquity, the judgment of political necessity has been integral to the justification of both Christian imperial administration and the ostensibly just overthrowing of such administration. In this talk, I will argue that the Protestant Black abolitionist David Walker gestures to how Ethiopianism conceptualized and practiced a politics of Black revolutionary religious contingency that exceeded and problematized the Western Christian logics of the judgment of necessity. The opening sentence of the American US Declaration of Independence argued that the injustice of Britain's colonial rule created, quote, the necessity of for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, end quote. Accompanying just revolution was a theory of racial difference and comparative enslavement. White patriots argued that whites were to be held in contempt for shirking the responsibility that history's course placed on them to overthrow their enslavement to British tyranny. However, Blacks were to be pitied for their enslavement because it was physical rather than political slavery. For white patriots, whereas physical slavery dominated the bodies of an unenlightened race, political slavery denied enlightened minds the independent representative government that they were entitled to through their demonstration of the capacity for collective self-government. This did not mean that physical slavery, i.e. racial slavery, was just. From Thomas Jefferson to Patrick Henry, slaveholding patriots at times admitted its terrible injustice. Rather, they in effect argued that judging racial slavery to be unjust did not establish a political necessity to fight its injustice. Driven by the reproductive sexual logic and their insatiable lust for Black enslavement, patriots scaffolded the conceptual distinction between political and physical slavery, tortuous fabulations of Black natural and cultural inferiority. A rich strain of scholarship on David Walker's seminal 1829 pamphlet, An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, but in particular and very expressly to those in the United States of America, helps throw into relief how Ethiopianism diverged from the judgment of necessity. Melding philosophical pragmatism and prophetic critique, this scholarship has contended that Walker's appeal signaled the emergence of a Black abolitionism that ultimately turned away from Black nationalism, emigration, and revolutionary separation from the US to claim the democratic potential of US citizenship. This scholarship argues that as citizenship claims in the early republic hinged upon the capacity to judge, Walker's use of the genre of the political petition to appeal to the judgment of his Black readers convened a Black democratic citizenry, modeling the Jeffersonian forms of democratic engagement that African Americans could use to persuade their white compatriots to oppose slavery and white supremacy. Yet perhaps the scholarship's affinity with John Dewey's pragmatist critique of logics of necessity has obscured the importance of necessity to judgment in early US Republican thought. The key issue concerning judgment was not whether slavery should be judged unjust or whether Black people were capable of judgment, but what political action the judgment of slavery necessitated. If Black abolitionists implied that while it had been necessary to overthrow British rule, anti-slavery revolution was now unnecessary because of the political possibility of reform through democratic political persuasion, then they indicated that US racial slavery was indeed not as political a form of slavery as had been British colonial governance over white slaveholding colonists, even if it was more physically and socially oppressive. Such an indication would have aligned with the post-revolutionary US constitutionalist project of delegitimizing religious justifications for revolt from below, and particularly for anti-slavery revolt, by arguing that religious liberty must not threaten the security of the state. However, attending to the Ethiopianist aspects of the Walker's appeals engagement with Enlightenment thought shows how Walker diverged from the judgment of necessity. Walker amplified the religious and Ethiopianist rhetoric of the appeal over the 3 editions issued between 1829 and 1830. In a paragraph added in the 3rd edition before the preamble, he stated that, quote, the God of the Ethiopians has been pleased to hear our moans in consequence of our oppression, and the day of our redemption from abject wretchedness draweth near, when we shall be enabled, in the most extensive sense of the word, to stretch forth our hands to the Lord our God, end quote. 4 paragraphs after this utilization of Psalm 68:31, in the preamble, Walker stated that against, quote, those who are of the firm conviction that heaven has designed us to be slaves and beasts of burden to them and their children, I appeal to heaven for my motive in writing, end quote. Thus, while Walker addressed the appeal to a Black audience, to him, his motive for writing the text resulted from his appeal to heaven. Here, the text called John Locke's use in the 2nd Treatise of Government of appeal to heaven to signify the right of revolution. No appeal to earthly government could achieve redress. Locke's phrase was prominent in the culture of the American Revolution, In the final declaration, the Second Continental Congress added to Jefferson's draft an announcement of the colonies, quote, appealing to the supreme judge of the world, end quote. The 1830 edition of Walker's appeal and the 1848 pamphlet binding the appeal with New York-based AME minister Henry Highland Garnett's 1843 address to the slaves, a famous exhortation of slave insurrection, both use the frontispiece Libertas Justitia, an illustration portraying a slave with her hands stretched out to the heavens. The illustration melded the Lockean appeal to heaven and Psalm 68:31. Whereas the Declaration of Independence proclaimed the necessity of the revolution against Britain, Walker's endorsement of slave uprising aligned less with the Declaration than with Locke's suggestion that the appeal to heaven was subjective and ultimately opaque, for only God, not a people, could judge if revolution or war was truly just or necessary. This also anticipates arguments that Ida B. Wells, Marcus Garvey, and Walter Benjamin would make concerning what Benjamin termed divine violence. Walker did not conclude that slave insurrection was necessary, but still suggested that Black people had the right to implement it. Walker thereby espoused political contingency rather than political necessity. By political contingency, I mean that for Walker, Black people had principled reasons to pursue a range of political options with varying relationships to the US political project. For Walker, the Black right of revolution was inextricable from the right to emigrate from the US. The appeal's critique of the effort to colonize African Americans in Liberia is often construed as a departure from emigrationism and Black nationalism. And indeed, like AME Bishop Richard Allen, Walker rebuked the planter-dominated American Colonization Society's attempt to redeem white America from the threat of slave insurrection or race war by removing freed slaves to Liberia. However, also like Allen, Walker endorsed the Black-led movements for emigration to Canada and Haiti, which the ACS opposed. And in addition to the third edition, Walker wrote, quote, if any of us see fit to go away, to go to those who have been for many years and are now our greatest earthly friends and benefactors, the English. If not so, go to our brethren, the Haitians, who, according to their word, are bound to protect and comfort us, end quote. While Walker condemned British brutality in the West Indies, his extolling of British abolitionism and emigration to Canada suggested that African-American freedom could be at least as, and perhaps far more achievable under British governance. This problematized the supposed necessity of the American Revolution from an African-American perspective. It indicated that the Black freedom struggle in the US transcended and was possibly, but not necessarily, antagonistic to US democracy in theory and practice. Endorsement of emigration to Haiti conveyed that the Black American struggle might be antagonistic to Western world order in general. For Walker, it was not faith in American democracy, but faith in Black Americans' sacred right of revolution and emigration that legitimated exploring the possibility of a non-revolutionary path of struggle for racial equality in the United States. Walker viewed Protestantism as the ultimate religion. However, his embrace of the option of emigration to Haiti, despite his negative characterization of its Catholicism, pointed to how political contingency involved religious contingency, i.e. exploring or practicing a range of religious dispositions or approaches to religion for principled reasons. Even evangelistically Protestant Ethiopianist movements often incorporated elements that Western norms would judge to be pagan or heathenish. Thus, Ethiopianism's religious practices were susceptible to critiques animated by the Enlightenment distinction between the tyrannical justice of the arbitrary and the universal justice of the necessary. The Declaration of Independence justified overthrowing the arbitrary government of British colonialism by appealing to the one universal true judge. From the Declaration to Jefferson and John Dickinson's 1775 text, The Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, the Enlightenment judgment of necessity drew from monotheistic distinctions between the universal one true God and the false gods. By the 1820s, pro-slavery counterinsurgency mobilized the Enlightenment iteration of the monotheistic distinction to condemn the religious contingency motivating Ethiopianist revolt as arbitrary, irrational, unreasonable, and false. The 1822 Denmark-BC slave conspiracy in Charleston, South Carolina, harnessed the contingency of the entanglement of Protestant and West African-derived practices in the city's African church. Founded in 1817, the African Church was the first AME church organized in the South and the forerunner of Emmanuel AME Church, also known as Mother Emmanuel, the church in which Dylann Roof murdered the Charleston Nine in 2015. Jack Pritchard, known as Gullah Jack, was a member of the church accused of stirring up insurrectionism with conjure, hoodoo, and charms, which in theory would run counter to the Enlightenment values of the appeal to citizenly reason. When sentencing Pritchard to be hanged, Judge Lionel Kennedy huffed, quote, "Your altars and your gods have sunk together in the dust. The airy specters conjured by you have been chased away by the superior light of truth, and you stand exposed, the miserable and deluded victim of offended justice," end quote. David Walker invoked Jamaica as an example of Black subservience to slavery. However, a year and a half after Walker's death in August 1830, the island became the site of an Ethiopianist uprising that seemed to fulfill his intimations on the possibilities of contingency, immigration, the Black Right of Revolution, and British abolitionism. Known as the Baptist War or the Christmas Rebellion, the revolt of around 60,000 Jamaican slaves in 1831-1832 was the largest ever in the British West Indies. Sam Sharp and other enslaved organizers were leaders in the Native Baptist Church, which had emerged from the Ethiopian Baptist Church of Jamaica, the denomination founded in the late 1700s by Black preachers who had fled the United States after the War of Independence. The organizers were also class leaders or deacons in the Baptist mission churches founded by white missionaries. This was suggestive of their acculturation to white Baptist norms. Yet, Native Baptism was infused with varying degrees of Mialism and Obia, which had developed in Jamaica from West African and Haitian Catholic traditions, and which more Orthodox Protestants, Black and white, viewed as superstitious fetishism. Indeed, the African American evangelists had originally invited the Baptist Missionary Society to Jamaica to combat their influence. Thus, no single understanding or imagination of religious judgment or of the relationship between Christianity's God and Mial and Obia necessarily prevailed among Native Baptists and Mission Baptist participants in the rebellion. And I'll end there. Thank you.
I am going to stand because leave it to the person from California to be like, "Where's my standing desk?" I can't sit down all day anymore. Okay. So it's funny because that was the perfect ending to where I am picking up. We talked about fetishism and all of that, and that's literally where I'm coming. Let me just make sure. No. I need to, sorry, can I, really quickly, I just need to get to my paper. I need to make sure I'm in like. Work. I think that's what I need. All right, let me just make sure it's advancing. Is it here? Anybody know how to get it where I can still do my, I need like an extended, you know, the extended. Which one is it? Usually it does it, okay, there it is. Sorry, usually it does it automatically, and I'm always trying to find myself. Of course, one time.
Instead of mirror, so use as up at the top.
Use as.
And then, yeah, stop mirroring.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. All right, so I should be able. Okay. What's it? Okay.
I think you need to.
Do I need to drag it to the new space?
So, yeah, so if you go up to like to the.
There, and then I want it on the other desk.
Right.
Thank you. I look like how it normally is. Thank you. Okay. I'm gonna just start and we'll just see what happens. Thank you. I feel like you did it. It looked right to me. Okay. All right. So this is where we started. We finished, and so in the January 7th. Oh, it works. There. Thank you. In the January 7th, 1934 edition of the Evening Star, published in Washington, D.C., an article featuring the picture of a white male Marine on one page. This is not that image. Unfortunately, I cannot find that image again. But a white male Marine on one page and an elderly Black woman on another ran with the headline, "Traces his weird misfortunes to voodoo prince of a Haitian witch." The inexplicably long article documented the trials of Captain John Houston Craig, described as a, quote, veritable D'Artagnan of the 20th century, whose separation from his wanga, or protective talisman, resulted in the series of misfortunes that prompted the newspaper story. According to Craig, via the writer, the wanga originated from, quote, that fascinating island of the West Indies, Haiti, where magic is the science of the jungle and voodoo is practiced not only as a superstition, but a religion. Marshalling imagery reminiscent of 18th and 19th century Western European and American accounts of West, and I would actually push that further back, maybe to the end of the late 17th century. So marshalling these images that are reminiscent of West and West Central Africa. The article details, quote, dark forests, uncivilized countryside, primitive sacrificial orgies, and savage rhythm of the cultural landscape in which the, quote, Negro witch woman, who allegedly had bewitched him, was ensconced. The woman was brought to Craig's attention by native Haitians who claimed that she was sacrificing babies in order to strengthen her soul. Recounting his first encounter with the woman, Craig claimed that she looked like a witch, and with her hair done in many curl clippers. She looks like a witch with her hair done in many curl papers and dressed in a motley array of tatters. The corresponding image, and you see here, this is Tituba, A Popular History of the United States, Volume 2, so these some similarities. The corresponding image of the woman in the newspaper augments Craig's description, displaying an elderly Black woman with tattered clothing and a neat expression, holding a doll, despite the absence of physical descriptors in the article, besides the impressions of her hair, clothing, and allegedly mulatto lineage. Though she called herself Kitty Smith in Haiti, a conversation revealed her to be a U.S. African-American woman from Elmira, New York, who moved to Haiti and became a Vodou initiate and Bombo after, of course, marrying a Jamaican named Montgomery. So I was like, it's always the Jamaican named Montgomery, right? Like, this is why we do things, right? So this is how she gets to Haiti, despite this very mystical account of her. So after confining Smith to a holding cell, Craig claimed to have seen Smith, this is the woman, in her cell, sticking pins into a, quote, cloth doll dressed like a Marine, but dismissed the sight and proceeded with his investigation. Fear, according to Craig, prevented the majority of witnesses from testifying against Smith on the charges of her killing babies, and she was released. 10 days later, he became ill with malaria and remained ill until a so-called wizard created the medicine and protective counterwanga that he sought at the outset of the article. Though skeptical of accusations against Smith and tales of her ritual efficacy at first, in the wake of the experience, Craig heeded the wizard's advice to keep the wanga near his person at all times, since Kitty Smith had sworn to fix him. So I use this as an entry point into thinking about these terms. So things like voodoo, witchcraft, hoodoo, black magic, conjure names, they all name a constellation of practices, and voodoo, that's small v, V-O-O-D-O-O. Name a constellation of practices and logics aimed at healing or harming through the manipulation of rituals and objects. As a category, the terms have long been used to describe the amorphous, extra-institutional features of religion among African descendant people in what is now known as the United States. For scholars and observers, conjure in particular has been at once a pejorative way of racializing the field of religious categories, and on the other, a term of reclamation intended to capture the rights that elude legibility within I like long sentences, obviously, within the historiographically and theoretically Christian field of African American religion. And the last panel was talking about very similar things. That what did you call it, Ashan? The Christian, not, you were talking about the dominance. It was the Christian chauvinism. There it is. Christian chauvinism. That's what we're talking about. As a practice, conjure remained a salient feature of the religious landscape through the 20th century, only becoming less prominent following the death of formerly enslaved people and with the atomization of conjuring practices and cosmologies into Christian denominations where healing assumed prominence. Yet the very indigeneity of the term, and by that I mean its obvious prominence in the parlance and thought of bond people and their descendants, but also we've heard that term circulating quite a bit here. I think the indigeneity of the term frequently precludes a critical examination into how the category functions in scholarship on Africana religions in the Americas. Specifically, how a term rooted in Western European lineages of metaphysical power and racist, racializing concepts of fetishism, which is what we were just talking about, became a repository for a range of Africana religious practices in North America that I would argue were all representative of a type of opacity, thinking about Charles Long. And by that, I mean counter-hegemonic expression and claiming of humanity over and against the discursive socio-political frameworks that strive and strove to reduce Black humanity to positions of subordination and enslavement. Sorry for these long, I don't usually do these long ones, but I'm just on these long runs these days, it seems. So in this vein, this presentation is really not about conjure, but rather Black humanity and the ways the violent, coercive dimensions of its enslaved and post-emancipation life appear in and guide the use of categories like conjure. And I would add witchcraft too, but hey, why not be a little controversial, right? We're live streaming. Let's talk about conjure. And this is all preliminary in terms of, not preliminary in my thinking, but very, very briefly kind of thought about here. So put differently, this kind of presentation is about, I would argue, the harming aspects of Black religiosity and to what extent the Africana religious category scholars use to categorize or help and categorize these harming elements, the elements that are not redemptive, that are not life-giving or anything. There's something else happening in Black religiosity. When we talk about things like conjure, and I'm asking the question, how, when we do not grapple with these things and categorize them, when we allow them to remain excess outside of what we are actually thinking and grappling with, how does it hinder the project of acknowledging the humanity of African descendant people in scholarly methodologies, theories, and methods? And I think this question of humanity is really one of the many questions at the heart of the critiques of the reductionistic production of Blackness in and through Western European religious categories. So to do this, I'm going to begin very briefly with an examination into the Salem witch trials. This is why you have a depiction of Tituba here. But just thinking about the Salem witch trials, Tituba, to think about the afterlife of Salem, really. And that's what I'm kind of coming into at one point in the book, thinking about what happens after Tituba. And then I briefly want to ponder the coercive and violent conjure repertoires, or just examples. Before finally, this is where I'm going to leave us, turning to a consideration of the archive and its role in reproducing methodologies, and categories that render one-dimensional portraits of bond people and their immediate descendants, of which I and many of us in this room are. So I want to read the ways African descended and enslaved and formerly enslaved people asserted their humanity through conjure practices, and not just good ones, the harmful ones. And use that as an opportunity to reflectively consider how we use these categories, well-worn categories like conjure, even witchcraft, the one I worked with in the book, and question whether or not they obscure more than they reveal. So a lot of questions. And so with that, thinking about Tituba and the afterlife of Salem, thinking about Tituba very briefly, I'm going to skip through just so we can get to the good stuff, but this isn't a super long paper. Tituba was a woman of color with ties to the Caribbean living in the midst of a colonial regime, very much like Kitty Smith, the Haitian model that I opened this paper with. So according to the earliest accounts of the 1692 Salem witch trials, Tituba was an Indian woman enslaved by the Reverend Samuel Parris, along with her husband, who was actually known as John Indian. So there was no question that she was of some sort of indigenous ancestry. So Breslaw has a beautiful book about Tituba where he tries to place her in the Caribbean. They think she might be from Guyana. They think she could have been Arawak. They're really not sure, but she is an indigenous person. So he's, Elaine Breslaw has examined Barbadian plantation records, and they confirmed that Tituba or Tatuba in the records was enslaved on the island for 4 years prior to her departure for the Massachusetts Bay Colony with Paris. So when in January of 1692, Paris's daughter, niece, and approximately 2 other girls in Salem claimed an array of physical afflictions, doctors declared that the girls had been bewitched. And upon hearing the accusation, Tituba tried what was called in records an experiment to locate the witch. So those of us familiar with Africana epistemology are starting to get the drift of what Tituba might have been thinking and doing here. And not just, I should say, Africana and indigenous, because she's an indigenous person. She tried an experiment to locate the witch, and that's some sort of gesture aimed at sussing out the malevolent person or entities. Her efforts were met with accusations from the girls who accused her of spectral appearances, pinching, pricking, and torment. She later confessed to the crime of witchcraft after slaveholders' urging and claimed that Sarah Osborne, described as a melancholy, distracted woman, and Sarah Hood, a bedridden elderly woman, were her co-conspirators. So in this way, Tituba became the first person to confess to the crime of witchcraft, and in doing so, inaugurated the chain of accusation that resulted in the protracted and now infamous trial. So she's famous, not only because she is the only woman of color to be convicted, she is also the first person to say, yes, I did it. And she took some people down with her. You can see how much I like that. So the trials probably would have occurred without Tituba's confession. However, her status as an enslaved non-European woman with ties to Barbados legitimized her claims and the resulting punitive fervor. In the aftermath of Salem, the trials were declared unlawful and witchcraft was relegated to the realm of superstition, unfit for enlightened progressive people. Now, I do need to make a caveat here. This is 1693 when this is going to come down in what will become the United States. They are still all over opium and stuff in the British colonies. So that is a completely different conversation. But this is what happens in the West. Accounts such as those published by Governor Thomas Hutchinson sought to offer what he called a rational history of the events, one predicated firmly on the premise. So he does this after they say witchcraft does not exist, and you will be prosecuted just for accusing someone of witchcraft. So he offers this history of Salem after this, and he says it does not exist, at least not among the civilized. So he demeans the accusers in his account, saying outright that, quote, there was nothing preternatural in the whole affair, but all proceeded from the most amazing wickedness of the accusers. That sounds pretty rational, right? As he declares. In the body of the history, he affirmed early accounts of Tituba's lineage, calling her a Spanish Indian, and relayed her confession that her mistress in her own country, so this is the language that Tituba is going to use, had taught her how to find a witch. And the question is, where is her own country? What is she referencing there? Even so this is what's in the body of his account. In the footnotes to the same page, Hutchinson says succinctly that Tituba and her husband, quote, were slaves, and that, quote, the Salem delusion had its origin in the fetishism practiced by these 2 ignorant Spanish African slaves, whom Mr. Parris probably obtained from Barbados. This abrupt about face in the narrative signals the presence of natives and Native and African presences in the colonies and of the metaphysical traditions that brought them. And just to give you a sense of this, I'm going to skip through some of these numbers. You know, I'm a historian. I love these numbers. So I did have all the statistics, but just to give you a sense, so between 1691 and 1700, you had a number of people disembarking into British colonies. But to put Barbados and what it would be Massachusetts Bay Colony into, or even the colonial Northeast into perspective, so you have about 16,000 people disembarking in the colonial Northeast in that short 9-year period, and nearly 200,000 in Barbados. So it invites a lot of questions about what Tituba, what kinds of cultural influences, what kind of cultural osmosis is happening in Barbados that she brought with her to the US, or what the Massachusetts Bay Colony that would be. So drawing upon this religious ideology, Hutchinson names Spanish African fetishism and not the long history of European witchcraft beliefs as the primary culprit in the trials. In this maneuver, he preempts the narrative arc of witchcraft that will dominate the post-Salem American cultural landscape. That is, the idea that so-called superstition and other refuse of European religious thought remain the province of Africans and indigenous people. Perhaps more specifically, it's interesting here, thinking about categories, how European epistemological understanding of witchcraft are going to provide the primary framework through which we understand and apprehend non-European, non-Christian religious orientations. And this is just one example in a historical space and time where this maneuver happens. We have carried this forward, or so in my controversial, provocative kind of tone of this talk, this is what we have continued to do. We inclusively. And so Western European notions of femaleness and Africanness, particularly African and Afro-Caribbean religions, are converging in this account, rendering her religiosity conspicuous, even though she attributes her ritual performance to her more powerful mistress. And so, of course, witchcraft of witches become more plausible via a supposedly non-white female practitioner of a non-Christian Afro-Caribbean religion. But here's the one way I want to challenge this here. You cannot see very quickly. I'm going to skip the second account. But what's really interesting is her examination seen here. So you see here, she's like, they ask, have you ever seen the devil? And she's like, of course I've seen the devil, you know? And then she goes on, and she's like, what is the appearance you see? Sometimes it's like a hog, sometimes like a great dog, this appearance. She said, she did see it 4 times. What did it say to you? The black dog said, serve me. But I said, I'm afraid. He said, I did not. He would, if I did not, he would do worse for me. And then she starts talking about the clothing. And at this time, they're envisioning the devil oftentimes in these puritanical visions is a Native American or a black man. Of course, does anybody want to guess what Tituba says her devil looks like? It's like, it looks like a well-dressed European with a top hat. I mean, this is a very long account, okay? So here, I want us, I'm thinking in this book, I want us to think about Tituba not only immortalized as a victim of her accusers' insidious lies, but also as an architect of future racialized understandings of diabolical religious practices. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's an interesting thing to think about the ways that women of indigenous and African ancestry were active in creating some of the legacies that we now critique. And this is about humanity. Okay? Humanity does what it needs to do to survive, okay? But also agency. I hate that word, but here it is, agency, okay? And Tituba stands in direct opposition to most of the accused who talked about how ludicrous these accusations were. They lost their lives in the process. Did Tituba die? No, she didn't. Yeah, oh yeah, Sean. Tituba saved her life with this scandalous response. So that's what's interesting. Like, she saved her own life. She walked free. even though she said I did it. And she did it with this amazing account. And there's an account with Candy as well, who says something very similar. And I talked about this also from Barbados. Candy is understood to be an African descended or African woman from Barbados. And she's like, this country, mistress give Candy witch. She's like, Candy no witch in Barbados, you know? And, you know, she goes on to kind of do something very similar to Tituba, and that is kind of deflect. And she says, no, that mistress who enslaved you, that gave me the witch. And I just want to this is my second to last slide. I want to think about that Salem and memory and the afterlife, the gendered racial afterlives. This is a diorama titled Tituba the Witch at the Salem Wax Museum of Witches and Seafarers in Salem. Notice what Tituba looks like, even though we know historically that this is not her name. Okay, very briefly here, just thinking about conjure and conflict, we use conjure as a catch-all category to describe a range of things, but they were using it, a lot of enslaved people used it to talk about a lot of things, medicinal and ritual protocols aimed at the mediation of conflict. Okay, so there's jealousy, there's greed, there's pettiness. There's a lot of stuff housed in conjure. And so just for give one example, Celestia Avery reported a woman stealing a man's sweatband and facilitating the man's death on account of having this intimate item and having its excretions, having the sweat. You know, she talked also about a conjurer who planted what they call ground puppies, usually like chipmunks or like these small rodents in her cousin's yard in order to reap the benefits once the cousin's wife became ill. So we have all of these things documented in the archives about conjure, how they battled ritualistic supremacy. Some were healing, but there was a lot of harming, a lot of coercive things happening. Okay? So to conclude here, I want to say that conjure was not merely something people attended to in times of crisis and for medicine, for healing. It was that too. But it was also a regulatory force among bond people. A threat of the human capacity for retribution, aggression, meanness, in spite of the rigors that united them. Okay? How do you have energy to still conjure people when you're enslaved? Think about that. That's a level of pettiness that is like, you have to go there. But I think it's amazing. And I want us to sit with it more because they were doing things. And some of it was retributive. I talk about that in my book. They did a lot of things in terms of retributive justice. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff where it's like, that was kind of wrong. So conjuring practices offer a window into bond people's preoccupations, their conflicts, other features of relationality that are more difficult to access via the archive. Conjuring practices are archives of materiality, ethics, ritual, and the dynamics of power among a group whose pervasive silences in historical record often precludes a window into these more interior aspects of their lives. Yet the paradox of the archive is that it is its very creation, and the documents of which it and artifacts of which it is composed are a production of Western European and white American epistemological orientations and material concerns. It was the seeming anomaly of Black people's conjuring and its utility in the project of demarcating whiteness vis-a-vis Blackness that gave historical life to the obfuscating typologies of which many of us are thinking about. So if we're accessing the opaque elements of religion among the enslaved and the free in the earlier periods, I would argue it requires methods and methodologies invested in the scholarly reconstruction or acknowledgement of enslaved people's humanity outside of these moralizing discourses that are so comfortable for many of us. Reading for the multidimensionality intrinsic to human life, inclusive of, but not limited to, ideals such as justice and wholeness, as well as those other things that we've been discussing, like violence, intracommunal violence. The things that we were talking about in the last, I feel like Jessica's paper as well, we're thinking about intra-communal dynamics and what we can and cannot question. But I think doing so brings the humanity of US bond people and their descendants into greater focus. It is one route to grappling with opacity in the historical methods and methodologies of Africana religious studies. I think ascribing to earlier iterations, historical iterations of Black humanity, what I think Black humans are still grappling with.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists and to Anderson and Michelle for setting this up, inviting me, and for putting this panel together. We actually really all fit together really well. So I kind of want to start right where you left off. We were talking about conjure. One important thing and resource that's really been underused are contemporary African traditions and peoples. When you talk about this petty conjure stuff, I'm like, yes, it sounds like the accusations at my father's family reunion. This is not something that's just dead and in the past amongst African and Africana traditions, certainly on the African continents, but also in the diaspora, especially in the Caribbean, Brazil, but also in the United States as well too. You can't always do a one-to-one correspondence, but sometimes you actually can. You find these talismans and things like that written out. Let's say in Brazil, and in West Africa, you have the kayfiyat, the description. This is this talisman, this is what it's for, this is how you use it. So I was working with, there's this new translation of Omar bin Said's biography. I Can't Write My Life, wrote his autobiography in Arabic. He was enslaved in North Carolina. And he has all these talismans in there. And Carl Ernst and Bailo were working on it. And they're like, what are these things? And I was like, oh, these appear in West African manuscripts all the time. Here they are, this is. And then Bailo's from Senegal, so he asked them for his friends. They're like, oh yeah, this one is for this, this one is for that, this one is for this. So, but the reason why this is not done, or it's done very rarely, brings me to my main topic of my talk, which the title of which I just decided is going to be one that I've used before. It's this great phrase by this Haitian anthropologist, Gina Effin Ulysses, which is, you're studying us, but who's studying you? And I want to start with the image. So on public radio, they were talking about Monticello recently, and the reconstruction of Monticello, since we're here in Mr. Jefferson's plantation university. When he rebuilt the dome in Monticello, he put these like 6 oculi in them. And the person there was like, oh yeah, these are just for decoration. But then one of the historians there was like, no, when I read the accounts of enslaved people, they talk about him sitting up there with a telescope. And said this was Jefferson's panopticon. Jefferson had Bentham's panopticon in his library, and he would sit up there and he could see everyone in the plantation and nobody could see him. And I argue that this is the way that our academy and our disciplines have been constructed. And this has to change. And so I'll start with 2 epigrams. One from James Baldwin was talking about his friendship with Norman Mailer fell apart. And it's something when I read this, I was like, oh, I really can feel where it's coming from. So somebody asked him about what happened between these 2 writers. And he said that Mailer still imagines he has something to save, whereas I never had anything to lose. And then the other epigram will be from Fred Moulton. As we mentioned here before, he said, to the extent that Black culture has a historic mission, and I believe that it does, its mission is to uncivilize or to decivilize this country. Yes, this brutal structure was built on our backs, but if this is the case, it's so that when we stood up, it would crumble. So I want to think about today is how do we stand up and what does that mean? So our panel is on Blackness, Epistemology, and Religion. I just want to focus on these 3 terms and then I'll read a little bit of what I have prepared. So Blackness, as I was thinking about this and listening to the comments today, Blackness is a site of objectification, of a pure object, not a subject that start from. It's literally the seeing unseen, right? It's the seeing of that which does not see, but it's also at the same time seeing the unseen. that which cannot be seen, and which, because you can't see it, you have this creepy, spooky feeling that it's looking back at you, even when you don't acknowledge it. Now, so there's this kind of phenomenological thing. When I look at something black, right, I'm seeing an unseeingness, but if you're surrounded by blackness, there's a darkness, there's a sense that you're being watched, that there's even if you don't acknowledge it. Now, blackness, as we normally talk about it today, this is a modern invention. I mean, for me, I remember when I became black. In Nigeria, when I was a child, I was yellow because I'm light skinned. And when I came to my first day of elementary school, my friends told me, "Oh, you're black." And I was like, "I'm not black, I'm yellow." And then I got in trouble because people thought I was a race traitor and whatever. So I had to navigate this. But I remember as I would move back and forth between Nigeria and the US when I was young, in this space I'd be black, in that space I would not be black. So this made it very clear to me from an early age, the construction of blackness and what it had to do with power. Nobody even today, especially if you're in rural Nigeria, blackness does not, you can't translate it into Yoruba with the same meaningfulness that it has in English. So this is itself as a particular construction of a set of power relations and of really cosmology, metaphysics, epistemology, which brings me to epistemology as well too. And it's interesting that this word epistemology only appears in 1847. It's a modern word. Now it's, episteme and ology and things like that. And the questions that are grouped in the philosophical category of epistemology. But epistemology as a separate word, term, concept, even as a separate discipline of philosophy. So it getting separated, that's also a very modern great construction. Separation of epistemology from ethics, from metaphysics, from cosmology. That's a very late and modern development. And I don't think it's coincidental that as blackness is emerging, epistemology is emerging, and then also the other term I want to talk about, religion, is emerging. Right? So the separation of religion and the secular, we see start happening in the 1500s, and again, at the exact same time that we're having the early slave trade and colonization of the Americas, the West Indies, and the slave trade coming from West Africa. And the split of the secular as the sphere above or beyond or outside this thing called religion is then mapped onto everywhere else in the world that people go. Right? So all of the intellectual traditions, the ritual, the political traditions of everyone around the world, if you're not white, if you're not part of the colonizing power, becomes religious. And the only way to get yourself out of that is to civilize, modernize, whatever, like the Japanese in the Meiji period. I mean, they're one of the funniest stories, the great book of this, on this, Jason and Andy Joseph and Storm, the invention of religion in Japan. Commodore Perry shows up and is like, "Okay, gunships, gotta have freedom of religion." Japanese have no idea what religion is. Right? The term doesn't translate. But this religion secular binary, just like things with witchcraft and stuff, gets put on everybody. And not just put on everybody, put on everybody in a racialized way. So Chidester in his book Savage System says when the frontier opens, the enemy has no religion, just fetishism, just superstition. But when the frontier closes, the contained, conquered population has a religion that can be understood, documented, and categorized. But in both cases, it's characterized as a bad faith or distorted engagement with reality. Right? This is Fanon's big downfall in Algeria and other places. He cannot understand Islamic practices in Algeria or African-derived practices in Martinique as anything other than a bad faith, refusal to face up to the real. Can't see that as a facing up to the real because he's limited reality to what he had from his training, his own initiation into his own things. So these three things come together to create the current system in which we have certain traditions that are viewed as secular, that are viewed as critical, that we get trained in the academy. We use them to study other things. We think with them, and we use them to interrogate Africana, Black religious traditions, not the other way around. Not the other way around, right? If so I remember I wanted to have in my grad program, we had to have 2 theorists of religion. And I said, okay, I'm going to do Ibn Arabi for one. Most influential Sufi writer, perhaps maybe the most influential Islamic writer of all time. So Ibn Arabi is one of my theorists. So you can't do that. He's not a theorist of religion. I said, why not? He answers these questions, does this, that. Unfortunately, my advisor was Jacob Olupona. Any of you know him, you don't want to cross that man. So he fought for me, and I was able to study him as one of my theorists and have my general exams for that. Why did I have to fight for that? And if you see the lines of who counts as a theorist and who doesn't, it's very clearly civilizationally, racially drawn. If you're a Europhone scholar, you're a theorist. If you're writing in a non-European language, you're not a theorist. You're a religious, maybe you're a religious thinker, but usually you're a confessional, you're a theologian, you're this, that, the other. And so all of our Africana traditions, our ancestors, these people who've gone before us and developed these really quite sophisticated and powerful ways of thinking, engaging, and being in the world are excluded. You can talk about them. You can use Foucault or somebody else, Deleuze or Durkheim, to interpret them, never the other way around. So rarely, if ever, are these traditions that we study actually learned from, right? Like I tell my students, when you take chemistry here, you learn chemistry. When you take math, you learn math. When you take a class about Sufism, you don't learn Sufism, you learn about it. You take a class about Africana religions, you don't learn them. In fact, it's illegal for me to teach kids how to do a proper chicken sacrifice to Orumila, right? It's actually illegal. But they can actually learn Christian theology here, legally. So these traditions, some traditions are thought from, some are thought about, some are thought with, some are thought against. Some are written from, some are written about. And this division is a wholly colonial line with, on one side, the racialized, the religionized, on the other side, the secularized, the white, transcendent, those who transcend religion and race. And these are, as Vincent Lloyd put it, it's a twin delusion. The idea that you transcend religion, that you transcend, everybody has metaphysical assumptions. Everybody worships something. Everybody has things that they sacrifice for. The illusion that you transcend race and you transcend religion, they're closely related. And the people who occupy those places are the same. You can even see this amongst like Black atheists, for example. So it's like, what's the God that you don't believe in? Most Black atheists, they've even done in these ham-handed survey methods, most people identify as Black atheists. They don't just believe in ancestors, they talk to their ancestors, they have interactions with their ancestors, which is very different from most white atheists. So it's the different gods that they're not believing in. They have different cosmologies. Okay, so I want to quickly go here to what would it look like to learn from these traditions. So I'll just, in terms of if I can't even separate out the epistemology, but because my dissertation research and a lot of my subsequent research has been about knowledge in 2 traditions really, the Tijaniya in West Africa, the Sufi tradition, and Ifa and associated Orisha traditions. So some of the lessons from these traditions is that all knowledge, all education is a form of initiation. It's a physical, bodily discipline and training into a particular ideal mode of subjectivity, a particular physical mode of being and seeing in the world. Some traditions are more aware of this than others. Some are more honest about it than others. It always involves sacrifice, even if it's just at the level of time or identity, what you want to do, all these kinds of, again, some are more honest than others, but it always involves sacrifice. And if you've been Black in the academy, you know the kind of sacrifices that are involved. Like I don't have to tell you. And it all involves worship. Any form of education involves worship. There's certain things that you reverence, certain things that you idealize, certain things that you try to approach as a standard. There are certain things that you'll give up things for, that you devote attention and time and love and care to. And this is true of all forms of education. But again, some are more upfront about this than others. In the traditions that I've devoted my professional life to studying, what you get, the knowledge that you cultivate is always existential. And again, I think this is true of all education, but again, some are more aware or honest of it than others. It's not just concepts. So in the Islamic tradition, they say that knowledge isn't in books, it's in people. Sometimes the knowledge was in people, and then people put the keys in books, but the knowledge is still in the chest of people. So they say you take knowledge from the sudur, the chest, not the kutub, not the books. Take knowledge from people, not from books. Knowledge is it's embodied, and because of that, it's transmitted from person to person. Knowing something, if it doesn't change your mode of being, you haven't really known it. This is true both in Ifa, where you literally eat the things that you make cuts and it's put inside of you. It's existential in ways that are difficult to describe. But in both the traditions that I focus on and study, knowledge is existential. But in studying that, I've come to see how it is in these other traditions, in which I've been training the academy as well. It shapes the way you see the world. It shapes what you see and what you don't see. What's possible, what's not possible. Even how you carry yourself is shaped by the things that you learn. In these traditions, because knowledge is connected to and knowing is connected to, it's existential, it's a way of being, it's therefore ethical. Certain modes and ways of being are incompatible with this knowledge that you're trying to cultivate. And so ethics is deeply tied to epistemology in a way that's really different from the Western tradition, which I was trained. Like, you can be a jerk and a master of any field. Yeah, that's simply not possible in these other traditions. Not that people won't teach you or people won't like you or they will promote you, but you simply won't know the things. Those forms of knowledge will be inaccessible to you. You can't hold that knowledge. So the example one of my teachers gave me was, you can hold wood chips in a sieve or a basket, but you can't hold water. More refined modes of knowledge require more refined modes of character. And because it's a mode of being, it's embodied, it's existential, also therefore aesthetic. Good modes of knowledge are beautiful. And this is just assumed in the Islamic tradition. There's this word ihsan, which means it wants excellence, beauty, moral perfection and beauty. And in Yoruba, the famous phrase, iwalewa, character is beauty, beauty is character. It's the identity between the ethical and the aesthetic is just like assumed in these traditions that I work on. Not in a moralizing way, like the art has to teach you a lesson, but rather good character, good knowledge implies good character, and that good character implies beauty of personhood, beauty of interactions, the things, beautiful speech, everything. Social beauty, which implies harmony and balance and justice, and all of these things. And then related to that is the deep relationality of all of this. Because knowledge comes from people, comes from your relationships with people, actually people and non-people, non-human persons. This is how knowledge is cultivated. This is how ethics are cultivated. This is how aesthetics is cultivated. It's profoundly relational. You can't be a lone genius sitting somewhere. That's just, again, in these traditions, that's not how it works. And so these are some lessons I think our current academy really needs to learn, but I don't know if it can learn it without being completely destroyed. Honestly, to speak honestly, which then takes me to, I'm gonna skip that part. I'll just read the end of this talk. That where I took the title from. Yeah, so I think we have to reject the racial logic that renders some traditions confessional and others critical, some religious, some secular. The critical or the secular resists admitting to its confessional nature, that is, it's assumed and often unarticulated metaphysics, ethics, politics, in order to maintain its dominance. The secular critical intellectual tradition is but one of many, and its recent hegemony of bloody purchase may give it more resources, but it doesn't make it better or more true. This is what religious studies, and I think a lot of other studies, can and must learn from decolonial studies to overcome what Sylvia Wynter says, calls our reluctance to see a relationship between the epistemology of knowledge and the liberation of people. The current world system might be hegemonic and homogenizing, but it's not omnipotent. So Vincent Lloyd writes that rather than mourn the extent of neoliberal hegemony, as contemporary critical scholarship has a habit of doing, remembering the religious or the theological, as the unmanaged religious is sometimes called, points to traditions of imagining otherwise. So I say that given the, I've learned to see all forms of education as initiation and worship, and given the vast, cruel human and natural sacrifices required by our bloodthirsty modern pantheon of profit, progress, power, and technology that are eating us alive and giving us back so little of substance, it's high time we heed the Yoruba proverb, which says, if you cry to your God and doesn't answer you, throw it in the bush and get a new one. So without serious sacrifice, the so-called decolonization of religious studies or the academy will just change everything a little bit to keep everything the same. And in sacrificing the opportunity to move beyond the coloniality that continues to govern our thought and life, will continue to impotently critically observe the ongoing sacrifices of entire peoples and ways of being and knowing. So Clyde Woods, and you know the geographer Clyde Woods. So we ask, have we become academic coroners? Have the tools of theory, method, instruction, and social responsibility become so rusted that they can only be used for autopsies? And then Max Hantel comments on this, says an autopsy tells us it's a kind of witnessing, etymologically referring to a seeing for oneself. The question concerns the optical structure of truth and our degradations of the human that separate the privileged observer. Imagine Jefferson in his tower, coded on the side of life from the marginalized populations already given over to death, present and future cadavers laid out flat for inspection. This, whether you want to decolonization or whatever you want to call it, I think is particularly urgent because our current academic, critical, and theoretical models have failed us time and time again. They might be fine for some things, like making technology like this or whatever, but for addressing the fundamental catastrophes and crises of colonial modernity, of meaning, of ethics, of justice, of truth, of beauty, of care, they've been repeatedly measured, weighed, and found wanting. As James Baldwin wrote, the white man's world, so I would say the modern academy, intellectually, morally, spiritually, has the meaningless ring of a hollow drum and the odor of slow death. Stuart Hall asks, against the urgency of people dying in the streets, I would say people now dying in Gaza, Sudan, all over the world, what in God's name is the point of cultural studies, of humanities, or religious studies? I think anybody who's into cultural studies, humanities, whatever, seriously as an intellectual practice must feel on their pulse its ephemerality, its insubstantiality, how little it seems to register, how little we've been able to change anything or get anybody to do anything. If you don't feel that as a tension in the work that you're doing, your theories let you off the hook. So I think part of why religious studies in particular, but other studies, humanities, the academy in general, has been so ineffective in opposing the depredations and horrors of the past several centuries is that it's thoroughly imbricated in the logics and structures, epistemically, financially, and politically, that keep piling up bodies on the streets and in places coded on the other side, zone of non-being. So what can we do in the face of these accelerating environmental catastrophes, genocide, epistemicide? I think we have to refuse these structures and their half-starved definitions of freedom and oppression, and learn with and from these so-called theological, religionized, racialized traditions instead of just learning about them. Let's learn from them how to be humble and free. Doing so might mean the very end of religious studies or the academy as we know it, but I think this sacrifice would be worth it, as would help us escape from the narrow well of coloniality into which most of us have been thrown, settler and indigent, white or not. And one of my favorite authors, Zhuangzi, said, a frog in the well cannot discuss the ocean because he's limited by the size of his well. A summer insect can't discuss ice because it knows only its own season. A narrow-minded scholar cannot discuss the Tao because he's consumed by his teaching. But now you've come out of your banks and you've seen the great ocean. Now you know your own inferiority, so it's now possible to discuss great principles with you. So I'm hoping that we can learn our inferiority, start talking about things that matter. Thank you.
So our panelists this afternoon have given us a lot to think about, and we unfortunately only have a few minutes to talk about it, to ask questions. But we're going to move into a Q&A right now, and if you would just raise your hand. And then we'll go from there. Any questions for our panelists?
So thank you all so much to think about. My question is for Professor Wells. I think I'm curious to hear you tell us more about how you're conceptualizing harm as a category, because I'm intrigued and I feel like aligned, like I appreciate the I guess what I'm hearing as an invitation to not flatten these categories into just the triumphant, but I am wondering, I think I hear harm as a moralizing category, and so I'm wondering how you are thinking about like what harm is, and then the kind of specific orientations like pettiness and greed that you made in how you think about harm.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I don't really think about harm specifically as a category. Like I really just always think about slavery. So, and really Black people's humanity. Yeah, you know, and I always say, how do we actually how do we narrate humanity in scholarship? Because I think we're all pointing to the problem of the tools. And there's a problem with the categories, and then there's a problem, you know, like, and these are problems I'm pointing to. There's a problem with the language that I'm trying to pay attention to. So for me, I think you could argue that harm is a moralizing category. I think there are moments where I can trouble that, you know, but then there are moments where I think that just wasn't right. But on another level, I think you can push it even further and say, you know, how do you just kind of, what language do we use without moralizing? Oh, that's the question that I haven't even begun to ask myself, because as I think about Conjure, I'm really just trying to, you know, again, as a historian who studies early things and early people, particularly enslaved people, the cultures from which these categories are being birthed and now they're being redeployed in these really interesting ways. I don't, you know, I want to see of the ways we're using them and mindful of the inadvertent ways that we do flatten, to use your language, flatten the cultures and the people from whence they came, when we're not attentive to the real intricacies and nuances of the historical appearance of these categories. But yeah, I think your question is very appropriate. And hey, push it further, because I don't really know, because I don't think about it as much. I don't think about harm as a category. But you got my drift.
Professor, for a question for Professor Oguneki. I love your talk. Happy whenever anyone responds. And I have a question about, on one hand, the academy, and I think of, you know, we struggle with this in studies of folks who do things in Sanskrit or you know, ancient languages, and read philosophers, but aren't taken seriously by philosophy, right? You can see this like really quite clearly. And something that I think of, especially thinking of Strong's, but also Arabic, these are writers and thinkers and practitioners who are being, right, like so deeply, who are extremely comfortable in multiple forms of writing and expression. And I mean, I think this is maybe a very basic question about sort of academic form.
Yep.
On one hand, do you think that you know, things like, you know, folks in Africana studies should be sort of more open to things like poetic expression,
Absolutely.
and scholarly writing, or even parable, meandering sort of poems and things like that, you know.
Yeah, this is,
Drama writing, you know.
I couldn't agree more. That's why my third book is poetry. It's just poems. It's just like the tradition. I mean, so my main tradition of ritual, there's a few others, but my main tradition of ritual formation is Sufism. And when people really want to say something important, like Ibn Arabi, when he wants to say something important, it's in poetry. Because in poetry, everything is connected to everything else. There are multiple layers of meaning. And that's the only way you can't capture reality, but you can point to different aspects of it. And so poetry is the appropriate speech for doing that. Ibn Arabi says in one place, says poetry is the substance of speech and poetry is the root and prose is the branch. Poetry is the substance, prose is the accident. So for him and that tradition which I've been trained extracurricularly, poetry is the substance. That's how when you talk about important things, that's how you talk. So that's why my most recent book is just poetry. But I think going back to the other thing, I think when you look at the history of things, you can see how so much of our academic practice is, it's like our academy is like a denomination of white Protestants. Like have these podiums that we sit at, the form in which the essays that we write, the articles, books, these things, like it's coming out of a particular intellectual tradition. And if you move even over to like orthodoxy, they write the Orthodox Christianity, they write differently. They have different physical setups for the church, for teaching, for things, and then you move to like an Ifa temple or something very different. So I would say, yeah, you can think about poetry and these other things, but I mean, honestly, like Babalao, they'll write things down now, but the way in which you express and cultivate knowledge is not through writing. It's not through writing, it's through memory and character and ritual performance. Like your final exam for being a Babalao, you recite things, you do divination, you do ritual practices. So the way I try to do that in my teaching here is through art projects. So I have students do art projects. So in the intro to Yoruba religions class, I have them do art projects. So we learn about, so somebody would learn a Shango dance. And you get a different understanding of Shango when you're doing the Shango steps, right? Or some people learn a lot about Eshu and they'll do some kind of depiction of Eshu. Or in the Islamic studies classes, they'll like write a poem in the form of that, or they memorize a poem and recite it. I two students who wanted to work on their tajweed, like Quranic recitation. So they picked a West African style of tajweed. They practiced, and they recited a surah of the Quran. They recorded themselves doing that. So there are different kinds of things we can explore. As you know, little things you can do, little spaces you can find. It's like, I forget the name for those little gardens that people were allowed to have when they were enslaved. What's the name for those grounds? Yeah, the provision grounds. So we can set up these like little provision grounds, but I think that the problems are much larger and structural. One of the good things about the academy falling apart is it's easier to make these little provision grounds. Things, there's just less structure. People are, the rules are less rigid. Everything's kind of falling apart. We need bigger structural changes. We can do these little things. We can write books of poetry. We can do different kinds of assignments. We can try to give our students a sense of freedom. I think part of the reason why the students love the art project so much is it's just like they have a sense of freedom. They're like, oh, I can express myself. I can engage with something aesthetically. So we can do these little things, but I think there have to be these much bigger structural changes. But it can start with these small things. Thank you so much for your question.
So unfortunately, we have to close things out, but before we do, I want to invite Michelle to come up and say.
On behalf of all the organizers, I want to thank again all the presenters and all the attendees who have made these conversations what they are. We hope these conversations extend past today. Hopefully, we found new conversation partners they can think with about these things. But for now, let's just give one more round of applause for all of you.